Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Today we're going to continue my series on what it means to be a Lutheran by looking at the sixth commandment, you shall not commit adultery. Luther said in the Small Catechism that the sixth commandment means that we are to fear and love God, so that we may lead a pure and chaste life in word and deed, each one loving and honouring his wife or her husband. Luther states in the Large Catechism that it is explicitly forbidden here to dishonour another marriage partner. Luther also adds that this commandment requires all people not only to live chastely in deed, word, and thought in their particular situation, especially in marriage, but also to love and cherish the spouse whom God has given them. Now, each of the Ten Commandments has three chief characteristics: its origin in the natural law, the overarching command that it seeks to protect, and the outreaching nature of the command and how it is applied to our life. The commandment originates in Creation Week on the sixth day when God created man and woman. God had created man out of the dust and saw that man was alone and in need of a helper. So God made for him a helper fit for him out of one of Adam's ribs. The Hebrew word here for helper fit for him is azer kenegdo. The word azer means helper or saviour or assistant and is used in the scriptures to describe, it is used in the scriptures in reference to saviors, partners, or assistants, reflecting the three ways in which a wife is to help her husband. One, from underneath, pushing him up to achieve his deeds, for as the old saying goes, behind every great man is a great woman pushing us forward. Two, a wife is to help her husband from alongside as his partner and co-worker. And three, a wife is to help her husband from above, pulling him up when he has fallen. The word kenegdo is often translated fit for him or comparable to him, but the word has a much deeper meaning. The negd part of the word means opposite. The o is a possessive suffix meaning belonging to him, and the ki is a directive prefix meaning like or similar to. Thus, a literal translation of kenegdo is something along the lines of an opposite that is similar to him. Men and women are created as complementary counterparts. They are equal in importance, but functionally different. What the man lacks, the woman has, and what the woman lacks, the man has. Luther writes, God created man and woman differently, as is evident, not for indecency, but to be true to each other, to be fruitful, to beget children, and to nurture and bring them up to the glory of God. God created male and female in such a way that when they unite, they bear children. But this goes beyond mere sex and conception. Men and women are not just physically different, but emotionally different and mentally different. Their brains think in completely different ways. But this is not a bad thing, for God has made them this way for a good reason. Genesis 1:27 says that in the image of God man created him, male and female he made them. God first created the man in his own image, and then he made the two genders, splitting man in two. Throughout the Bible, God is spoken of as male. But while God is Father and Son, the Scriptures also attribute to God not only masculine attributes, but also feminine attributes. This is because man and woman are two halves of one whole. When they, through marriage and sexual union, become one flesh, they embody the whole nature of God, the masculine and the feminine. God says in Genesis 2:18 that it is not good for man to be alone. Men and women were created to be together. By themselves, they are lacking what the other gives. Woman is like man, but opposite to him, having what he lacks and vice versa. It is for this reason that children need both fathers and mothers. Neither parent can fill the void that the other lacks. Children raised in single-parent households, or God forbid, same-sex households, will always be lacking something that is vital to their development. As Luther said, the differences in man and woman is not just about begetting children, but about nurturing them and raising them. In Genesis 2:22, God brought Eve to Adam and united them in marriage. Verse 24 continues with, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." In this verse, we have the institution of family. Father and mother, parent and children, husband and wife. And this is ultimately what this commandment is about. What this commandment seeks to protect is not just chastity and marriage, but the main concern is the institution of family. The reason why God desires the preservation of chastity is for preservation of the entire family, so that couples may stay united in love and care for one another, and that parents may work together for the sake of their children. It is at this point that I'd like to point out that chastity is not the same thing as celibacy. Chastity refers to sexual purity within one's vocation. That is, sexual intercourse for those who are married and no sex for those outside of marriage. This leads us to the overarching nature that this leads us to all those things that the commandment forbids us from doing and commands us to do. Jesus states in his Sermon on the Mount that adultery is not limited to just physical acts of sleeping with someone who is not your spouse, but that lustful thoughts about someone who is not your spouse is considered adultery in your heart. Luther said that this commandment commands us to live chastely in deed, word, and thought. Luther said, "There is such a shameless mess and cesspool of all sorts of immorality and indecency among us. This commandment is also directed against every kind of unchastity, no matter what it is called. Not only is the outward act forbidden, but also every kind of cause, provocation, and means, so that our heart, our lips, and our entire body may be chaste and afford no occasion, aid, or encouragement to unchastity." This commandment forbids all sexual morality, including lustful thoughts, lewd and smutty joking, cohabitation, sex before marriage, prostitution, promiscuity, homosexuality, bestiality, pornography, masturbation, divorce and remarriage for reasons other than adultery, rape, incest, and of course, adultery proper. This commandment seeks to protect marriage as the union of one man and one woman for life, forsaking all others. Forsaking all others is a rejection of adultery. Hebrews 13 says, "Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous." For life forbids the breaking of marriage, that is, divorce. Marriage should only ever be ended by death. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:39, "A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives, but if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord." And Romans 7:1-3 says, "The law is binding on a person only as long as he lives. For a married woman is bound by law to her husband while he lives, but if her husband dies, she is released from the law of marriage. Accordingly, she will be called an adulteress if she lives with another man while her husband is alive. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, and if she marries another man, she will not be an adulteress." Jesus says in the Gospel that divorce for any reason other than adultery is sin. This is because marriage is a contractual union, in which each spouse devotes themselves to the other, vowing to remain faithful. If one has defiled the marriage bed, they have broken this contract, and therefore their spouse may divorce them. The one who is cheated on is free to divorce and remarry without guilty of committing any sin. This is the only reason given to get a divorce, as Jesus says in the Gospels. But this teaching is not limited to the New Testament, it is also from the Old Testament. In the Gospel, the Pharisees reference Deuteronomy 24:1-4, which states that a man can divorce his wife if he finds uncleanness in her. Now, the Jewish rabbis argued for millennia over this term, uncleanness. Some take the narrow view that this is a reference to adultery, while others take a more broad view and teach that this uncleanness refers to anything that is unpleasing to the husband. In the Gospels, the Pharisees argued with Jesus that Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. This followed their question, is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? The Pharisees asked if it was okay to divorce for any reason, and then they quote Deuteronomy 24, showing that the Pharisees took the broad view of Deuteronomy 24. Jesus, however, quotes Genesis 2:23 about man and woman being one flesh, and states that the only reason for divorce is adultery, showing that Jesus understood the term uncleanliness in Deuteronomy 24 to mean adultery. And since Jesus is God, his interpretation of this verse is the correct one. This can also be seen in Jeremiah 3, where Israel is referenced to God's divorced wife. Jeremiah 3:1 is a direct reference to Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, stating that if a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's wife, that he can't return to her. Then verse 3 of Jeremiah proceeds, Then Jeremiah 3 proceeds to speak of Israel's uncleanliness. In verse 2, she is said to have been ravished all over the place, that she sat waiting for her lovers, and was polluted with whoredom. And verse 8 is the more explicit saying, For all the adulteries of that faithless one Israel, I sent her away with a certificate of divorce. Jeremiah chapter 3 makes it clear that a man was only to give his wife a certificate of divorce if she had committed adultery. Some will point to 1 Corinthians 7:15 and argue that desertion is a reason for divorce, but this is not entirely accurate. In 1 Corinthians 7:12-16, Paul is speaking of Christians who are married to unbelievers, most likely because the man or the woman converted but their spouse did not convert. Paul says to the Christian that if the unbelieving spouse wishes to stay married, then the Christian should not get a divorce but should stay married. He then says if the unbelieving spouse separates, then the Christian is free to remarry. The word for separate here is chorazetai, which means to separate, and is the same word used by Jesus in Matthew 19:6 and Mark 10:9 when he says, what God has joined together, let no man separate. This word is a synonym for divorce. Thus, what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 7 is not that Christians are free to get a divorce if their spouse deserts them, but that if their spouse divorces them, they are free to remarry. This applies for any situation. If a couple gets divorced, but the divorce is one-sided, meaning that only one person wants to leave, but the other doesn't want to get a divorce, then the obligation to rectify the issue lies with the one who instigated the divorce. If the one who instigated the divorce is a Christian, then God's word commands them to return to their spouse. As Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:10-11, a wife should not separate from a husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to a husband. But in the case of 1 Corinthians 7:15, when the one who instigated the divorce was an unbeliever, they will not listen to God's word, and the person who did not instigate the divorce is then free to find a new spouse. But before we move on, note that Jesus says adultery permits a person to get a divorce, but they are not commanded to get a divorce. Observe the situation of the prophet Hosea. In Hosea chapter 1, God commands Hosea to marry a prostitute named Gomer. In chapter 1 and 2, it suggests that Gomer has continued to be a prostitute even after her marriage. Many scholars believe that since Hosea's son, Jezreel, is explicitly said to be born to him, while the other two children are just said to have been born, and the fact that children 2 and 3 have strange names such as No Mercy and Not My People, suggests that the second and third children of Gomer are not actually Hosea's at all. Some scholars will also point to the phrase in Hosea 1:2, have children of whoredom, to mean that some of the children were conceived due to Gomer's prostitution. If we then read in Hosea chapter 3 that Gomer has gone so far as to sell herself into sex slavery. Now, according to Deuteronomy 24 and the Gospels, Hosea had a legal and spiritual right to divorce Gomer, for she had committed adultery. But instead, Hosea goes to her whoremonger and buys back his wife. he reconciles with Gomer, telling her that she shall come and dwell in his house once again. This is a reflection of God's love for his people. For even though we, like Gomer, continue to commit spiritual adultery with idols, God continues to still love us and forgive us and reconcile with us. Remember that Jesus says that divorce was okay in the case of adultery, but also that adultery is any kind of lustful thought. Therefore, based on that definition, we could say that a person could probably divorce because their spouse has had lustful thoughts. So while we may be free to commit a divorce in the case of adultery, the example of Christ shows us to forgive rather than to divorce. Now the words one man and one woman clearly reject such things such as homosexuality. But one issue that is not so black and white is the issue of polygamy. Genesis 2:22 makes it clear that God intended for marriage to be one man and one woman, and yet polygamy did occur throughout the Bible, and is nowhere explicitly called a sin. The Levitical laws do not condemn polygamy, but instead gives guidelines on how to manage it, such as not taking your wife's sister as a second wife. And Deuteronomy 21 says that if a man has two wives and he has a son by both of them, then he must give his inheritance to the firstborn, regardless of whichever wife he prefers. And in Deuteronomy 25, 5-10, there is the practice of levirate marriage, when a man must marry his brother's widow and father children for his deceased brother. In such a case, if the man was already married, he would now have a polygamous marriage. And in 2 Samuel 12:8, God explicitly says that he gave David Saul's wives. In this case, God is actually the result of the polygamy. Thus, polygamy, while not the intended goal of God's institution of marriage, is not actually forbidden. Martin Luther says in his Genesis commentary, commenting on the polygamy on the patriarchs, "Advise it I do not, forbid it I cannot." Luther was also a big supporter of levirate marriage. There was in Luther's day a controversy regarding polygamy. Philip, the Landgrave of Hesse, was married in 1523 to a, as quote, sickly and unattractive woman for political purposes. Within 3 weeks of his marriage, he had already committed adultery. In 1526, he wrote to Luther and asked about the possibility of a second wife, since he could not sleep with his sickly wife. Philip asked the question as a hypothetical and did not tell Luther of the actual situation. Luther wrote back that he strongly advised against polygamous marriages, especially for Christians, but that if there was extreme necessity, for as example, if the wife was leprous or similarly affected. For in such a case where a man could not have sex with his wife, it would be better for him to marry a second wife rather than divorce his first wife or through lustful passions fall into the sin of adultery. In 1531, the Englishman Robert Barnes asked Luther and Philip Melanchthon about the situation with King Henry VIII, who sought to divorce Catherine of Aragon. Melanchthon stated that polygamy was not absolutely forbidden by divine law, and that for the sake of avoiding divorce and for the political ramifications, it would be best for Henry to take a second wife. Luther stated, "I would allow the king to take another wife according to the example of the ancient patriarchs and kings who had 2 wives at the same time." Regarding Philip of Hesse, he had found a woman whom he wished to make his second wife, Margaretha von der Salle, the daughter of one of his sister's ladies-in-waiting. Margaretha only agreed to marry Philip if she could get permission from the theologians. So on December 10th, 1539, Philip spoke with Luther and Melanchthon in private confession. Here, he disclosed his long struggles with adultery and sought their permission for a second wife. Luther and Melanchthon gave Philip their approval. However, when the marriage became public and it was a huge scandal, Luther refused to acknowledge his approval of the relationship as the advice had been given in private confession and was thus meant to remain under the seal of the confessional. However, in a letter in June 1540, Luther wrote regarding the whole controversy, and here he says, If such a matter as this of Philip's came before me today, I would advise as I have already advised. I am not ashamed of such counsel, even if it should come before all the world. What is most intriguing, though, is that Luther also states that he did not advise Philip to have a public marriage. Luther writes, "What I expected was that, since he was obliged owing to the weakness of the flesh, to follow the ordinary course of sin and shame, he would perhaps keep an honest girl in some house and wed her secretly, though even this would look ill in the sight of the world, and thus overcome his great trouble of conscience. He could then ride backwards and forwards, as the great lords do frequently enough. Similar advice I gave also to certain parish priests under Duke George and the bishops, namely that they should marry their cooks secretly." So while polygamy is not condemned in the Bible, it is advised against, as God's original design for marriage was for one man and for one woman. Additionally, Deuteronomy 17:17 states that kings should not take many wives, although many scholars say that this is not a prohibition on polygamy, but that they should have only a few wives and that they should not seek a great number of wives. It's more about a sin of covetousness, wanting more and more and more. Also in 1 Timothy 3:2, it does explicitly state that pastors are to be the husbands of one wife. So the only people commanded in the Bible to not be polygamous were kings and pastors. This is because as heads of states and heads of the church, they are examples to the flock. 1 Peter 5:3 states that shepherds are to be an example to their flock, and in the context Peter says that this is reference to pastors. But also in Ezekiel 34, kings are referred to as shepherds to the people. As leaders, we are to set good examples. Therefore, kings and pastors are to set examples of how marriages should be. One man, one woman, for life, forsaking all others. Having now discussed what the sixth commandment forbids, we should take a moment to look at what it commands us to do. The Bible gives us 4 reasons for marriage. The first is companionship. In Genesis 2:18, God said that it is not good for man to be alone. In 1 Corinthians 11:8-9, it states that the woman was made for man. The two are to be united in one flesh, as one person, companions for life. The second reason for marriage is childbearing. After creating man and woman, God gave them to command to go forth and multiply. Children are called a blessing from the Lord, and it is God who opens and shuts the womb. Thus, married couples are commanded, if able, to have children. And it is for this reason that birth control should not be used unless pregnancy would put at risk the life of the mother or the child. The third purpose for marriage was to reflect the relationship of God and his people, specifically the relationship of Christ and the church. In Ephesians 5:31-32, Paul quotes Genesis 2:23 and then adds that this is a profound mystery, and I say it refers to Christ and the church. Throughout the Bible, the husband is compared to Christ and the wife to the church. Their marriage is an earthly image of our relationship with God. And the fourth and final reason for marriage is that and this is one that was not part of God's original creation, but is something that exists now post-fall, and that is to curb sexual immorality. In today's society, there is all this talk about sexual orientation, heterosexuality for those attracted to the opposite sex, homosexuality for those attracted of the same sex, bisexuality for those attracted to both sexes, and asexuality for those attracted to none. And this is just a brief summary of the great depravity that goes on in our world today. This is not the way the Bible speaks. The Bible instead has but 3 categories: chastity, sexual immorality, and celibacy. Technically, celibacy is considered a subcategory of chastity, but I decided to speak of them as separate categories here because I'd like to make a distinction between the celibate leading up to marriage versus those who are celibate for their whole life. So the first is chastity. This means sexual purity. That is the reservation of sexual intercourse, sexual deeds, and sexual thoughts for marriage alone, between one man and one woman. God created man and woman to be attracted to the opposite sex. Romans 1:26-27 calls this natural passions. God instituted the office of marriage as the place for sex to take place. Outside of marriage, it is not to exist. Therefore, Those who are not yet married but intend to get married are to keep their thoughts, words, and deeds pure and chaste. This leads to the second category of sexual immorality. As mentioned, God created everyone with a desire for the opposite sex. Therefore, things such as homosexuality and bisexuality are not part of God's creation, but merely our sinful human nature rebelling against God. Romans 1:21-27 states that because people by nature knew God, but in their wickedness rejected him, he handed them over to their impurities of their hearts, and thus they exchanged natural passions for unnatural passions and dishonorable passions. But sexual morality is not just limited to homosexuality and bisexuality, for God instituted that sex should exist only within marriage. Therefore, all sexual deeds and thoughts outside of marriage are also sexual morality, not just adultery, but all those things that have been listed above. And the final category is celibacy. As mentioned above, all who are not married are to remain chaste and celibate. However, the Bible does speak differently about those who remain celibate before marriage and those who never marry. As we have mentioned above, Romans 1 speaks of natural passions and unnatural passions. But there is also the category in the Bible of no passions. Today we may call them asexual, but this is not accurate. God has created them as heterosexuals, but they simply lack a sex drive. The scriptures speak of two types of such people: eunuchs, that is, those who have been castrated and have thus lost the physical ability to have such passions. And the second is those like St. Paul, who just had no passions. Paul makes it clear in 1 Corinthians 9:6 that he and Barnabas never married. And in 1 Corinthians 7:7-8, Paul states that he wishes all people were like himself, that he was unmarried, and that widows should remain unmarried like him. He says this immediately before telling those who can't control their passions to get married, meaning that what he means by like himself is that he is able to control his passions and not to have unwanted lustful thoughts. Martin Luther refers to these people, like Paul, as rare exceptions and have a high, supernatural gift that allows them to remain chaste outside of marriage. In Matthew 19:10-12, Jesus says that it would be good to remain unmarried, but that not everyone can do this. However, for those who are able to do this, let them do so. In 1 Corinthians 7:32-38, Paul praises those who are able to control their passions and not get married. For the one who is married is concerned with his wife and children, and is unable to devote his whole life to God and neighbor. And so says St. Paul, if you are able to control your passions and devote yourself fully to the service of God and neighbor, this is a noble task. But St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7:36, and this returns to the fourth purpose of marriage, if one has a strong passion, then let him marry. For as he says in 1 Corinthians 7:9, if one cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Luther says, where nature functions as God implanted it, it is not possible to remain chaste outside of marriage. For flesh and blood remain flesh and blood, and natural inclination and stimulations proceed unrestrained and unimpeded, as everyone observes and experiences. Therefore, to make it easier for people to avoid unchastity in some measure, God has established marriage, so that all may have their allotted portion and be satisfied. For those who have a sex drive and who would burn with passion and fall into sexual morality, let them be married, so that they do not satisfy their passion, so that they are able to satisfy their passions within the divine institution of marriage and quench their sex drive in a way that is pleasing to God. This then leads us to the topic of conjugal rights. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 7:1-5 that while it is good to remain single in order to avoid sexual morality, let man and woman marry. He goes on to say that the husband should give his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but her husband does. Likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but his wife does. Husbands and wives are one flesh. Their body is not their own, but their partner's. Therefore, they should not withhold sex from the other. Paul states that it is good for married couples to refrain from sex for a period of time, just as it is good for Christians to fast from eating and spend the time in devotion to God. So too it is good for couples to fast from sex and spend it in time of devotion to God. But St. Paul warns us, do so only for an agreed upon limited time, and then come together quickly, lest the devil lead either of you away in temptation. As mentioned above, one of the reasons for marriage is so that people may have an appropriate way to satisfy their passions. Therefore, if husbands and wives refrain from sleeping together, this becomes meaningless, as the spouse can no longer satisfy their passions and will be tempted by the devil into adultery. Therefore, husbands and wives, do not deprive your loved ones of their conjugal rights. For you are one flesh, and your body belongs not to yourself but to your spouse. Lastly, couples should remember that the principle of one flesh is not limited to sex only, but to marriage in general. As Luther said, this commandment requires all people not only to live chastely in deed, word, and thought in their particular situation, especially in marriage, but also to love and cherish the spouse whom God has given them. The sixth commandment is not just about sexual relations, but about marriage and the family, about husbands and wives loving and caring for one another. As Luther continues, wherever marital chastity is to be maintained, above all, it is essential that husband and wife live together in love and harmony, cherishing each other wholeheartedly and with perfect fidelity. This is why St. Paul so urgently admonishes married couples to love and honor each other. Married couples are one flesh. Your body is not yours but your partner's. Paul tells wives to be subordinate to the husbands, and husbands to be the head of their body, for he is the head of their body. And he tells husbands not to harm their wives, for their wives are their own body, and so they should treat them with love, cherish them, nourish them, and protect them just as they would their own body. You should treat your spouse as you would treat yourself. Wives, respect your husbands as you would respect your own body. Husbands, love your wives as you would love your own body. Treat your own body as if it belongs to your spouse. For example, clothing and grooming. You should not insist that this is my body, I will dress as I wish. Remember that your body is not yours but belongs to your spouse. Therefore, you should dress in a way that is pleasing and edifying to your spouse. Remember that your body is your spouse's and not the world's. So do not dress in immodest ways that expose yourself to the world. Instead, remember that your nakedness is your spouse's nakedness. So reserve your body for your spouse. Additionally, health and fitness. Remember that your body is not your own. Just as you should treat your spouse's body as if it was your own, loving and caring for it, you should treat your own body as if it belongs to your spouse. Therefore, you should take care of it for their sake. Remember that any harm you do to your spouse is harm done to yourself, and any harm done to yourself is harm done to your spouse. In marriage, man and woman are one flesh. There is no longer mine and yours, but everything is ours. Marriage is not 50% husband, 50% woman. It is 100% husband, 100% wife. And lastly, remember that Christ is our bridegroom. Every time we sin and disobey God, we are essentially committing adultery against him. But no matter how much we fail and fall away, God will always love and redeem us. In Jeremiah 3, God is the husband, and his people are the adulterous wife who is falling into impurity and unfaithfulness. But to us God declares, "Return, I will not look on you in anger, for I am merciful." Christ is the loving and forgiving husband who will never fail us. We are faithless, but he remains faithful. And that ends my lecture on the sixth commandment. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Join us again next time as we continue our series by looking at the seventh commandment.